Hey, I'm Shaye Warner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Lydia about non-family transition plans. She shares her story as well as her experiences helping others with these types of transition plans. This is one of those topics that we don't talk about enough, and Lydia offers some great pointers. So let's hear what she has to say. Hey folks, I've got a quick heads up for you. Clear cattle identification is only useful if you can actually work with the information afterward. That's where cattletags.com comes in. They help ranchers not only design clear, consistent ID systems, but also think through what happens next. Their team ensures everything works together, from linking visual tags to EIDs to organizing those IDs so they're usable in your record system. Cattletags.com is one of the largest all-flex distributors in North America, and their team raises cattle and uses these systems every day. Learn more at cattletags.com. Lydia, it is a pleasure to meet you and have you on the show today, and I'm excited to talk about your story and experience with a non-family transition plan, because I don't think the industry talks about those opportunities enough, so thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Shaye.
So help the listeners get to know you a little better by sharing why you are passionate about transition planning.
So I farm in southwestern Manitoba, just over the U.S. border. I live on mile 25, so not too far from North Dakota. I started farming in my 20s with my spouse, who's from South Africa. He immigrated at 15, so neither of us had immediate family members that were on the farm. I still do often refer to myself as first generation. My grandfather came over from the UK and started farming in Canada and then subsequently went to war and didn't farm upon his return. So we're just a few generations removed. I'm super interested in agriculture. I always found it really fascinating. I grew up in a city. I just thought it was just a really interesting industry, and my spouse always wanted to farm. Being passionate about farm transition or farm succession, we actually kind of started off being really interested and passionate about production and building a business. And I have an interest in kind of complex systems. I did my master's thesis work in coastal fisheries in Brazil, looking at how ecological and social systems interact. And I started a farm business after that. And then I realized that there were so many opportunities in agriculture for kind of mapping out systems, communication, and a lot of that was happening within farm succession and transition planning. So yeah, passion, I think, is kind of a combination of passion and interest. I find agriculture really fascinating as an industry, and I find farm transition succession planning a particularly interesting area of agriculture.
You have a unique and diverse background in agriculture, and I think that's really valuable to have individuals like yourself in our industry. So tell us a little bit about your transition story and the operation you're on now, because that wasn't a family transition. Can you just explain kind of the beginnings of where that started?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, we started a farm business, my partner and I, my spouse and I, when we were in our 20s. And we started on leased acres. I grew up in the Red River Valley. Folks that live in the Red River Valley will know that land in that area is quite expensive. And we had decided that we were going to run a livestock operation. So we kind of came west to the western part of Manitoba, where agriculture is a bit more diverse and mixed. We were leasing land, and we built a bit of a direct-to-consumer meat business off of that initial lease. So we had sheep and hogs and poultry, and we did not own land. So we kind of knew that in order to build equity in agriculture, we were going to need probably things on four legs that were liquid. So cattle was kind of the area we focused on. And we farmed, I say on our own as first generation for maybe 7 years or so. We subsequently started buying heifers from an individual that was living in Alberta at the time. And it's a very interesting story, Shaye, but these are often how these things happen. He was originally from Scotland, had moved to Canada in 2000, and subsequently decided to sell the land in Alberta and move to Manitoba. This is not uncommon that folks will sell farms in areas that have a higher land value and then move to areas and expand their operations. So he did that. But before doing that, he had asked us if we were interested in working with him more closely, whether that be in Alberta or Manitoba. And so when he moved here, he bought a farm not too far from where we were renting at the time. And then we started working together. So we run individual operations. So we file our own taxes. We've got separate businesses. Both businesses are profitable. We have similar structures in our business, but we run separate entities. And then we're working together. And so he is about 20 years our senior. So there's not a huge age gap, but recognize that in order for us to be able to access land and build our security, we were going to need some support from another generation. And so we started purchasing land to build our equity from him and his wife. And then subsequently, we run our cattle together. We kind of run cow-calf, and he runs cow-calf. And then we purchase animals from him to put into our direct-to-consumer meat business as well. So we're neighbors, and we are purchasing assets from him, so land assets, and we work together. And I think, transitions take time. It's not the kind of thing that happens overnight, but a relationship builds over time, and trust and accountability builds over time, and recognizing that we are compatible, we have similar philosophies around management. Our transition or succession planning is kind of a longer term strategy.
So does he have any kids or family involved or not involved? What's kind of the dynamic there?
So he has a daughter. She's not involved in agriculture.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but is he primarily the one who initiated the conversation offering to partner with you guys? I mean, I know you talked about how you have your separate business entities, and I really appreciate you explaining that structure, by the way, about how you work together, but there's also separate entities, etc. But is he the one who kind of made that first outreach of, here's an opportunity I'd like to offer to you guys?
Yes. So there had been correspondence back and forth. At that time, we were already running a business. So we weren't scaled. We were running on lease acres. We had built a business. We had an interest in management, land management, and livestock and cattle. So just stockmanship and that sort of thing. And my husband kind of made the original contact with him to start discussing how to bring some of the cattle to Manitoba. He had been running a direct-to-consumer business in Alberta. So we kind of had a pen pal kind of thing going back and forth. And so I think he recognized something in us as far as a potential for his future business planning. And I think that's kind of the key, is being a bit future focused, like seeing, okay, there may be an opportunity here. So he had reached out to us to see kind of what our thoughts were on working together more closely and that sort of thing. We were in a position when we first started renting, when we first started leasing land, we were also figuring things out. The first leases that we had were kind of year to year, and that was really challenging for future planning. We subsequently got into lease agreements that were kind of 3-year rolling leases. We got better at asking for what we needed and drafting leases and like being in the business of agriculture. And I think that there was kind of a mutual understanding at the time then between us, or that he could see that we were starting to understand how this business worked. And we were in it as a business. We wanted to build something. So he first approached us as the founding generation.
Okay. Now, previously you mentioned that transitions take time and building trust takes time. Do you want to dive more into what went into building trust in your specific relationship with the founding generation?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak for myself, Shaye. It'd be interesting to see what my farming partners would say about this. So I can just give you some insight. Trust is an interesting thing because I think there is like accountability. Is there like general accountability? Even like business acumen can help build trust, right? So there's like this concept of readiness and willingness. Like as next gen, and I'm trying to just think of myself as a young person, am I ready to take it on? Do I have the financial literacy or the interest? Do I have an interest in like general good practices and standard operating procedure and agreements? And if I do, as an operator, see that those are kind of necessary things, does the person that I'm getting into business with also see it that way? You know, like you hear stories sometimes where it's like, I would like a contract and they want to do it on a handshake. And so part of it is like a conversation and communication and just like having a similar philosophy around how to manage. And so I think because there was some alignment around, okay, when you do a rental agreement, we write it down. Or if we are, for example, like he feeds our cows he puts up the feed over the winter and then charges like a yardage fee and I expend an invoice every month, right? Like I think there's just some like clarity of expectations that is really important. And then it builds over time. So it's not without risk, certainly, to like invest in somebody. However, I think having open conversations about, you know, agreements, business structure, general profitability of the business. Are you making money or not? Can you make these payments? And like trust is then built over time through general accountability.
Can you talk about the agreements portion a little bit more? Because I think there are still a lot of individuals in agriculture who like just that handshake agreement. But what is the importance in maybe having other contracts or things at least clearly written out as far as expectations? Because you've explained how, you know, you expect an invoice every month for yardage, but maybe there are other individuals who don't quite operate like that. So I just appreciate you expanding more on what those agreements can look like and outlining those expectations.
Well, and I think you just hit it. It's outlining those expectations, right? It's like communicating, it's negotiating, and you're always like working through this concept of like contracting, whether it's your family or not. And I know some people don't do this, and I think this is where people run into difficulty, like feeling overwhelmed or anxious, or like not knowing what the future holds. Or even sometimes the founders feel like they're underappreciated because maybe equipment is being used, but the value of that equipment is not being acknowledged in some way. So, I mean, that's just an example. And I'll speak from my perspective. And a bit of the journey that we were on was that when we started farming and leasing land, we kind of had some looser agreements, but these were not family members, right? They're neighbors or acquaintances or people you meet. And what I realized kind of early, and this is something that made me anxious, even as a young 20-year-old, was like, okay, we live where we work. So usually a value would be put on the land, and I'm in Prairie, Canada, so you probably can relate to this, that the housing was often sometimes an afterthought. I don't know that that's like the greatest approach like forever, but in this case, we were after land. So we would rent, like for example, we would rent like a smaller parcel or a quarter section of land. And when we first started, our first lease was year to year. And then I realized, well, not that we could put up a bunch of infrastructure anyway, because we didn't own the land, but it was really hard to plan. So the idea of building a business that was dependent on security of tenure on a land base where you only had year to year did not feel very good to me. Now, these were the people we were renting from were not our family members. So I didn't have an expectation that without some kind of written contract, they would just keep renting to us in perpetuity. I think sometimes we take that for granted, but in this case, because I'm coming into agriculture from the outside, I kind of already had this anxiety pretty early on. So then we started to secure, I would say better, like more secure leases because we were asking for that. And then when we started to get closer, we started to get into the idea of like we could, you know, that our neighbor and I and my spouse, we could all work together. I just said, I really need to own something. Like I need to build equity in something. So I need to have that security of tenure so that we could build infrastructure for our business and we would have a home and all that. The individual we were working with, his name's Ian, he understood that. So we needed someone who kind of understood that. And so the kinds of agreements, like at the time, so similar to how it sometimes works in families, because we talk about this a lot, like how do you get into your first piece of land, for example? The vendor financed, so our neighbor helped finance that first purchase. When we talk about like contracts and agreements, in this case, I'm in Canada, so it was all done through the province of Manitoba. It's a registered mortgage. We used lawyers. We went to people who were competent and understood what we wanted to do, and they helped guide us through the process. Now, for other types of like agreements around like winter feeding and that sort of thing, basically we just kind of agree to certain yardage rates and then we have invoices that go back and forth. And so that's a clarity of expectations piece as you outlined. But part of it too is like we were not coming into this with a family history of certain behaviors in agriculture. Like we were kind of fresh. And when we first started Shaye, I felt a little bit, well, I certainly was naive, right? Because we're having to learn this. Even things like, I'm in my early 20s and I remember thinking like, how do people do this? There's got to be a per acre rate per year or something. Like, how do farmers do this? Trying to figure out even rental rates. We kind of had to start fresh on everything. And we got really good at just asking questions and being inquisitive. And therefore we were kind of open to best practices because we didn't have anyone kind of holding us back from asking those questions, right? We didn't face judgment. We didn't face insecurity or guilt about asking or inquiring at the very least for what we needed. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And I'm really appreciating your honesty in this conversation. Now, I am really curious, what was it about Ian that made you and your partner trust him and say, yes, this is the person that we want to do business with?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of things. I mean, you talked about this concept of being like honest or forthcoming. I think that's part of it, just like an honesty, almost like a directness, like respect within the industry, just general intelligence and competence around his business, and even putting faith in us, right? It feels good when you really feel like you could do it. We feel like we could do this, but there was things in agriculture that were difficult. Land values, for example, or like financing for first generation back to the farm. And so really he took a chance on us, right? Because in the sense that like we didn't have all that much to lose. We had to make payment. Like we had to figure out how to work together and how to make payments. This was the opportunity for us that somebody was giving us. And so given the rapport that we had early on and just the friendship, and I would just, sometimes there are things and you think, oh, that's just like too good to be true. There like weren't a lot of red flags. It was like, well, we need to have agreements. Okay, yeah, let's do that. It just kind of flowed. Like we worked well together. I think there was like good business sense was part of it too. And using best practices. And I mean, it happens in all kinds of industries. Like you said, we don't talk about this as much in agriculture, but you see this happening in other industries where there's a family business. You could think of construction or roofing or a hardware store, whatever. And someone in the family is not going to take it over. And so a key employee is kind of chosen or selected, or they work with them to do it. And that's because there's rapport, there's like the understanding each other's work ethic, and there's a history. So I think these things build over time, but it just takes a certain degree of like acumen and thought and a little bit of chance. Yeah.
So if there are other individuals on, I'm going to say, the rising generation, or they want to be the first generation, or, I mean, basically they don't have the family farm to go back to, whether it's not the right fit for them or there just isn't one. What advice do you have for them to find the right opportunity?
So first off, I would say that these can be great opportunities for founding generation as well, right? Because there are many people who don't maybe have successors, or who have a great business and love their business and would love to have somebody take it over. I've been asked this question by other rising generation or first gen, or just people back to the farm, or even folks that are in agriculture and maybe their family situation is just not amenable or working out. One thing I suggest is like living and being in the community that you see yourself farming in. So if you're from a, peri-urban or semi-urban area or urban area, and you think, okay, I really would love to get involved more in the grain industry, like move to where there's grain elevators and grain farms, and like where you could work on one of these operations, or you could be handling, like working in some aspect of the industry. And I can only speak from experience, so this is anecdotal. I haven't done any research on this, but one of the things that we did was like we used to go to a lot of things. Like we would physically be present at different events in agriculture. Both my spouse and I are quite like curious and vocal individuals. Like we we're not shy about sharing what we wanted to do and seeking out opportunity. So saying to people like, hey, and even like our naivety, because we didn't grow up on a farm, even though we gained a lot of agricultural experience early on, it didn't feel shameful for us to ask questions. And I say this because I know a lot of people struggle with things like imposter syndrome, but we were just really curious. So I always say to folks, like, ask questions, like get into the business that you want to be in, create your own business plan, seek opportunities. And this is some advice my husband got early on when he was a teenager, like think bigger. In other words, I'm on the prairies. There's a lot of people who will start with smaller land bases because that's what they can access. And they'll try to make do and build a business with that. And that's really great. But also that like, like I'm in Manitoba, the average size farm here is about 2,200 acres, which in some jurisdiction is very large and in some jurisdictions is small. But think about the scale of what you can operate at. If you grew up on a farm, you're probably already kind of in that mindset. If you didn't, it might be harder to imagine. But there are farms, I think, that are looking for successors who can run the business. Sometimes that business is scaled. So I say move to the community you'd like to be on, find mentors and leaders in that community that are in agriculture, that know the business well. Don't silo yourself in any particular production type, unless, of course, philosophically you have very good reason to do so. So in other words, like sometimes people get like really specific about what they want to do, but then the opportunities around them are like even bigger than that. Those are some of the tips that I would give to people just based on my own experience.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked about, clear agreements, outlining expectations, building trust. You just offered some great advice for the younger generation for how to seek out these opportunities and be successful in doing so. What aspects about non-family transitions are important to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
I would say that it particularly if you're in a non-family transition, sometimes I think when we're in a family situation, we just take for granted, like, we farm. It's part of our identity. It's part of who we are. In a non-family situation, there's a real proposition, I think, around managing a business and being in business together. And so maybe building some of those skills. Everything I'm saying, Shaye, would also work for a family situation. It's often, I think, why people run into issues. But like if a non-family situation, like, yeah, building your skills, having conversations about agreements, being open about what it is that you're looking for, also being able to like compromise and know that not everything can happen all at once, knowing for yourself as an individual, what does security mean to you? Where do you kind of feel like you're in the sweet spot, where you feel comfortable enough kind of moving forward? Non-family transitions, having clear agreements, and also finding advisors that are open to it. And what I mean by that is that might seem silly, but there are some jurisdictions in the world like where this is more common. So I've heard that in New Zealand, for example, there's infrastructure and systems that are set up to help facilitate more non-family transition if family members are not interested. We have at times asked accountants and lawyers for kind of like creative thinking on this issue. Some people are kind of like, oh, I don't really know, I've not done this before, where other folks are like, oh yeah, this is great. Like, we're interested in this, we want to build this out, we want to support you, we have ideas. So finding a team of people that can help you. Because I do farm transition conversations with folks working with Elaine Fraze, I have had folks reach out to me that own a farm, for example, and they're like, we don't really have anyone. Do you know anybody? Or like, we know that you're in this situation. Do you know anybody else? And so one of the things I think is even having like policy, and this is like bigger picture, but even like policy, whether it's at the state or provincial levels, that helps to address this issue. Where when people are looking for a non-family person to take over their business within agriculture, that we, and I say collectively at our like governance levels, have some infrastructure available to facilitate that. That's just kind of a future focused thing as far as like what are the things that we're maybe not talking about. Those might be some of the bigger picture things. And then I would say kind of at the farm level, I think this kind of goes across agriculture, that we're potentially like even as a group not talking enough about the finances and enough about structure. Even as peers, we don't always know what's possible. And so I think maybe what's missing from the general farm succession transition conversation is just like the peer support to talk about the kind of tactical, structural, and, business options that are out there.
All right. Now, what would be some red flags for, we can say either the founding generation or the rising generation, whichever role you want to take on it? What would be some red flags that the transition plan that they're working on is not going well, or that they should reconsider?
Okay, so this goes probably for all kinds of farm transitions, family or non. And I mentioned earlier this concept of like readiness versus willingness. And so sometimes people are willing to do something, like they really want to bring in the next generation or succeed their business, or next gen, like you really want to farm. And so you're very willing, but you may lack a readiness. So like you might not have the skills to execute or the accountability in place, or you might not have the financial literacy. Those things can be gained over time, right? So, but general, like if I'm just going to speak from my own experience, and this is just broadly, like having spoken with lots of farms and things that maybe we even experienced in previous lease agreements, some red flags would be a lack of, like, no desire to have written agreements, like not wanting to put things down on paper. Another one might be just general lack of financial literacy or like poor money management. That can go for either generation. Profitability within the business. Now, in our situation, we run two separate businesses. So we're not necessarily taking over a business that's not profitable. But if you are coming in, for example, and you're coming into a business that's not profitable, it doesn't mean that it's a no-go. It just means like being aware of that, because then you're going to have to build in additional profitability, and there are ways to do that. Another one too could just be like people's general health and well-being. So the ability to work with them. Are you having compatibility issues because someone is really struggling with unresolved mental health or addictions issues? There's going to be some interpersonal stuff that could be red flags as well. But as far as like the business side goes, I would even say just like another red flag might be just like a lack of interest or initiative in doing a business plan, or like wanting to write contracts or that sort of thing. Another one would be like a lack of willingness to meet. So a lack of willingness to come to the table. And that just might indicate the depth of the relationship. In other words, I might rent land from a neighbor down the road, and we have a pretty simple lease agreement, or he or she doesn't really want to engage. Like, my cattle are out there, that's fine. That's the nature of the arrangement. So I would say like another red flag might be if you're getting into business with someone and they just have a general disinterest in talking about business. This happens in family farms as well. And then family versus non-family situations, obviously, like I'm coming into a situation where I've got my own staff and I've got my own family of origin, but I'm able to leave some of that behind because I'm coming into a non-family situation. So I would say for families where you're working with your family members in the business, sometimes understanding your family dynamic and like past histories and trying to resolve some issues can be helpful as well.
Okay. Well, Lydia, if there is one thing that listeners take away from this conversation today, what do you want that to be?
I would love if the listeners could just see that there's possibility. My general outlook, even when things are difficult, is like there are opportunities. And just for folks to know that there are options, they're not without work and investment. And of course, there is an element of, there's an element of luck. I like the concept of like luck is where preparation and opportunity meet one another, right? So like we prepared for a long time and an opportunity arose that we were able to then invest in. And so I would say to folks, like, seek opportunity. And this may sound very cliche, but even just like thinking outside the box and reaching out to peers that will communicate with you. And what I mean by that is there are people in the industry that will talk about their structure. They will talk about finances. They want to be open. And so if you're trying to seek out options and you're thinking about this, look for some of those mentors and people in the industry that will help you.
All right. And Lydia, where can people connect with you if they so desire?
Yeah, so folks can reach out to Farm Family Coach. My email is Lydia, Lydia, at farmfamilycoach.com. My farm name is Luna Field Farm. That's the farm that we direct market under. So it's LUNAFIELD Farm. So you can look us up and you can find our farm website as well. And so there's a couple different emails and ways to reach out to me. So please feel free to do that.
All right. Well, folks, that information will be included in the show notes. So once you are done listening to this podcast, be sure to go check that out, as well as find any other links that were mentioned throughout today's conversation. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and better yet, share it with a friend who's going to find this information valuable, because podcasts still grow best by word of mouth. But with that, happy ranching, folks.